Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 166 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I'm happy to be joined by a familiar face, if you've been following the podcast for very long, John Richardson. John was on the podcast last year in episode 144 and 149, I believe. Yes, those are the correct episodes. So if you like this episode and you want to go back and hear more from John, go and check out those episodes 144 and 149, where we talked about his campaign to get on the ballot for NRA Board of Directors. I'm happy to say he was successful in that effort, and he is now on the ballot to campaign and to be elected for the NRA Board of Directors. And we're here to talk about what's going on at the NRA, what's sort of this dividing line between the reformers and sort of what I call the old guard, or sometimes called the cabal, or the friends of Wayne, that is Wayne LaPierre. So with all that being said, John, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. It's a good time to come back.
Yeah, and I don't want to forget this point, and I'm sure we won't, but ballots will be coming out in the mail to folks through various publications from the NRA. Would you mind to just get that out of the way here at the front? Talk about that a little bit.
You should expect your ballot if you're getting the magazine, the American Hunter, American Rifleman, America's First Freedom, etc. As I understand it, they are due to arrive in your mailbox somewhere right around January 29th. And then that you'll have until April 6th to submit your ballot. Let's put it this way. It's not received by April 6th, but postmarked by April 6th. And it goes to the CPA firm that does the counting, etc. One thing I would like to just really point out, on average, for the last number of years, maybe 5% of eligible voters have voted. There's 95% not voting that are eligible. And I don't think they're kind of like Democratic voters in the cemetery or anything. I think they're just, it doesn't matter. It does matter. We need you to vote.
Yeah, and this is not like, a national election and for president, right? I mean, a singular vote can have a big difference in these elections. There are
Correct.
not that many votes cast. And you mentioned eligibility to vote. What are the requirements to be eligible to vote?
Sure. There's two different eligibilities. Number one, and the most obvious, is you're a life member. And you have until, I'm going to say, March 7th to join as a life member and still be allowed to vote. Other than that, you need to be an annual member with 5 years continuous, unbroken membership. And that's the key thing. 5 years with no breaks, 5 continuous years. So you're actually in your 6th year of membership.
All right. So with sort of the mechanics here out of the way, they should expect a ballot in the mail in these various publications. If you've been a life member, a 5-year member, or a annual member for 5 consecutive unbroken years, you'd be eligible to vote. And I mentioned, and I'd like to give a little bit of background here. I mentioned sort of this line in the sand between reformers and the old guard. If you don't mind, John, give us a little background to where that sort of division happened. And I think a good place to start is probably 2019, when there was sort of this falling out. I'll put it.
That's a good way to put it.
Or attempted revolt in 2019 at the NRA annual meeting in Indianapolis.
And that's a good place to start. At that time, the president of the NRA was Ollie North. First VP was Richard Childress. And Ollie North and Childress, and for part of the time, Carolyn Meadows sent a letter out questioning the hiring of Brewer attorneys and counselors, because the amount that they were paying them was above what it had to have been approved by the board, and it had not been. And then they started, then there was a whole lot of Machiavellian goings on Wayne accused them of trying to blackmail him, which was pretty much false. And I mean, it's like you're dealing with the Borgias, because you had an attorney on one side whose father-in-law was the head of the other company, and they hated one another, and so they were trying to force out Ackerman McQueen, and then Ackerman McQueen has all the dirt on Wayne, and it just snowballed from there. And by the end of that, soon thereafter the meeting, the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, who has never been a friend of the NRA, said, we're going to be investigating the NRA. There's some problems going on. And as they are a New York nonprofit corporation, it is within my power to do so. And that just opened up the whole Pandora's box, and here we are today.
Yeah, and we're recording this January 18th, 2025. It still sounds weird to me, only 18 days into 2025, saying 2025. So that was nearly 6 years ago. And in the meantime, there's been this basically infighting at the NRA about, are we going to get behind Wayne LaPierre, who was formerly the executive vice president of NRA, and defend his actions and defend the actions of the NRA? Or are we going to try to clean house and rectify the situation at the NRA, stop the bleeding financially, stop the bleeding in terms of membership, et cetera? And finally, there was some progress toward a resolution of that issue. Last year, there was this lawsuit, as you mentioned, by the Attorney General from New York, Letitia James, which was cast or painted by the Wayne LaPierre group or supporters as a political lawsuit against by people who just hate the Second Amendment, hate individual liberty, and there's no merit to this. It's purely political. Well, as it turned out, what they discovered through that lawsuit, right, was that actually, yeah, it may have been a politically motivated lawsuit, but there was actually a lot of bad stuff going on at the NRA in terms of, mishandling of funds, not accounting for funds properly, use of funds for things that look like personal expenses, luxury suits and flights to NASCAR races and all sorts of things. And eventually there was a judgment against Wayne LaPierre and then also against the NRA itself. And in the wake of that, right, there was the NRA annual meeting last year in Dallas, and the 4 Reform, 4 candidates who were sort of leading the charge for reform of the NRA, got elected to the board and were able to make some waves at the NRA or within the NRA board of directors. Now, of course, another year has gone by almost, and you and a number of others are running for the board as reform candidates. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is different this year from last year when there was this 4 for Reform movement?
Yeah. Last year, we encouraged people to bullet vote. Just vote for the 4 for Reform. Jeff Knox, Phil Journey, Rocky Marshall, and Dennis Fusaro. Vote for those 4 and only those 4. Well, it worked because they came in 2, 3, 5, and 15th. And you had at least 2 former presidents of the NRA who didn't even make the cut. This year, we're taking a different approach. We have a full slate. Everybody has been vetted by both Rocky Marshall and Buzz Mills, who are somewhat organizing this. And we're all dedicated to NRA 2.0. And instead of saying vote for 4 candidates or 10 candidates, there are 28 open positions, and we have a full slate of 28 candidates. And it's important to vote for the full slate. And the rationale is that if we leave a spot open on the ballot, then that means somebody from the old guard could slip in. And our goal is not only reform and to back up the existing reformers that are on the board, but to push out those who have stood in the way of reform. from the beginning, including, I have to say, Bob Barr, NRA president.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to point out is that even though the Four for Reform had some success, they were elected, they got onto the board. It seems that there was still this significant contingent of people who supported Wayne LaPierre, right? And so I think part of the motivation, correct me if I'm wrong here, is with these 28 candidates running on the reform platform, the hope is to get a critical mass of board members who are for reform, who are for cleaning up the mess that was created by Wayne LaPierre and his cronies, and to actually make some progress toward fixing the problems that were identified in the New York lawsuit, and not just sort of, it seems like the NRA is in this sort of stasis right now, and not really making a whole lot of changes. I know there was just a board meeting in Dallas where there were some critical changes made. So I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. But also,
Sure.
if you don't mind, comment on sort of my perception about what's going on.
Yeah, they did have the board meeting this past weekend in Dallas. There were a number of resolutions that were considered, a number that did pass, good resolutions. Let me just step back a second. After the Four for Reform were elected and on the board, the May 2024 board meeting, you did see changes. You had the old guard candidate for executive vice president initially was going to be Charles Cotton, and there was an uprising about that, and they switched to Ronnie Barrett. Doug Hamlin got elected. Two of the three officers elected were from the reform camp. President was Bob Barr, but he was from the non-reform camp, the old guard. There was hope after that meeting that Barr would, I should say, the president of the NRA under the bylaws has the authority to appoint the members of virtually all committees, and that he would then put an equal number of reformers with the old guard, and especially on the more important committees, bylaws and resolutions, audit, ethics, finance. He didn't do that. In fact, while there were some, I think audit committee had initially one person that was considered a reformer, Rocky Marshall, and he put in a lot of the old guard, especially those who had been the strongest supporters of Wayne and who had been dragging their feet all the time, such as Charles Cotton, David Coy, etc., back in their positions as either chair or vice chair of these committees. The final, eventually, due to the final order and the court order, they were actually pushed out. They were not, the judge said, these people cannot serve on these committees because he didn't come out and say they were guilty of dereliction of duty, but the implication was strongly there. The January meeting, they finally got rid of the Special Litigation Committee. The resolution originally was brought up in September, but through Robert's Rules of Orders, it was ruled out of order, so therefore it couldn't be brought. It was brought in January, and it's gone.
And that's important. I want to pause there just a moment.
Yeah.
That's important, this dissolution of the Special Litigation Committee, because, right, that was seen sort of as the committee that seemed motivated to protect Wayne and protect the actions that were taken by Wayne, or at least at the directive of Wayne LaPierre, right? And that sort of seemed to get the NRA in this perpetual litigation to seemingly line the pockets of the law firm, the Brewer firm.
Absolutely.
Is that an accurate depiction?
That is more than accurate. It was a committee of the board, so three people acted on behalf of the board with the full board's authority. They did not have to bring stuff back to the board. And the initial rationale for having it was that the executive vice president and the then general counsel and secretary, John Fraser, both were named defendants. So therefore, the people who had normally handled litigation for the NRA were defendants, so therefore should not be involved in making the decisions. The Special Litigation Committee, as it was constituted at the very end, was Bob Barr, Charles Cotton, and David Coy. One of the problems, and it was in the NRA's Form 990, their federal tax filing, was that they kept no minutes and that they approved, the only record of approving legal bills was by email. They on a monthly basis. So the rest of the board could ask questions and they would get no answers. So if stuff was, any discussions were off the record, they said, as it was explained to me by a board member, said we were always told they were in executive session, and I'm not sure who made the decision, but that's how it ended up. And so they let Brewer run up a bill of almost $200 million, while at the same time the NRA has lost approximately 2 million members because people were sick of it. I mean, I ran into a long-time, old-time gun writer down at the Dallas Safari Club, and I asked him, why, are you an NRA member? He says, not anymore. I let it go because I was tired of paying for Wayne's stuff. And this was a guy that you would have said, you would have been sure he was a life member, and he wasn't. And I got that more than once. And so the Special Litigation Committee is gone. Supposedly, Wayne has paid the $4.6 million due to the NRA as a result of the trial. The Brewer law firm has...
That was a judgment against him personally.
Personally, yeah. And he owed it to the NRA.
Yeah. And a lot of folks, and I think rightfully so, said that was a small number compared to the damage that he did to the NRA, and I tend to agree with them. But nevertheless,
and I think the AG's office estimated it at one time that really the true cost was closer to $13 million.
Yeah, yeah, and one of the, going back to the Special Litigation Committee, one of the criticisms of that committee was that it was almost like a committee for Wayne, to protect Wayne, and there was this conflict of interest between Wayne and the NRA, and then also between the Brewer law firm and the NRA, because
they were the ones who made the decision to file for bankruptcy, which was money thrown away that on a legal strategy that had no chance of winning. I did find it, I don't know if you'd say amusing, but interesting that, Wayne was, got to protect Wayne. And the moment he resigned, it was all Wayne's fault. You're hearing that from the Brewer attorneys. It's all Wayne's fault. The NRA was guiltless. Everything done. It's all Wayne's fault. And it's like, that was interesting. I mean, one anecdote told to me by an attorney who was pretty high up in the NRA at one time, NRA ILA, he said that Brewer had a pair of plastic handcuffs and waved them in Wayne's faces. I will keep you from having to wear these. I will keep you from out of jail. And that seemed the way it was run, not protect the NRA, but protect Wayne from the very beginning.
Yeah, and that's right. And the priority of keeping him out of jail was in conflict with the interest of the NRA and its members. And so that's partly why, anyway, the dissolution of the Special Litigation Committee is such an important step.
I mean, really, you had a two-part trial that, in hindsight, given the final order, it looks like something that could have been negotiated at the very beginning. Once you had dissolution of the NRA off the table, and from what I understand, most of the attorneys in the New York AG's office, not her, but her attorneys, were very pleased to see that off the table because now they could get down to business.
Yeah. Well, in your example of the Brewer firm saying after the trial was over, it was all, now they're saying it's all Wayne's fault. I think the other possible motivation, I'm just speculating here, right, is they want to stay on the dime of the NRA going forward, right? So there's maybe dual motivation there.
Except they supposedly have ended all. They've severed
Now,
their
right?
relationship now.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, there was this judgment against Wayne. There was also findings that the NRA had engaged in wrongdoing, and we found out just this week or last that Wayne had paid this money to the NRA, but I think only to stop the accumulation of interest on the judgment, because now we find out, right, that he has appealed and wants to claw back the money that he paid into the NRA.
Yeah,
So that shows you the audacity that he has, and sort of the, I don't know, the, I'll just say arrogance, I guess, that he has about what he did to the NRA and as the executive vice president of the NRA.
which brings up another question. When you use the word clawback, there was a resolution, and I think it's under New York law. If an officer or director is indemnified and then is found liable in court, the organization must claw back the monies paid for the legal defense of that officer or director that they indemnified. Now, the big controversy whether it was they indemnified him or they just advanced him the legal monies to pay Kent Correll. Either way, the money paid to defend Wayne LaPierre by the NRA under New York law appears to be should be going back to the NRA over and above the 4.6 million. And you know there's a resolution that was presented. I've looked at the trial transcript where the judge made reference to indemnification, asked the Brewer lawyers about indemnification under New York law, and they said something about advances. So there's a semantic war going on, but there is an attempt to pull that money back. And I would go a little further and say, even though John Fraser was not found to have to pay any money damages, he was found in violation of fiduciary duties, and therefore any monies paid on his behalf should also be tried to be clawed back.
Yeah, which is a significant amount of money, no doubt.
Yeah.
Um, I want to go back to the reform efforts that have gone on the last year or so. Because I was a little too, I think, too harsh on the reformers earlier, because I said that my perception is that we're in a bit of a stasis, and I think that that's true, but I think that's a success to some degree, because they've stopped the bleeding more or less, which I think is incredible. That had to happen. You have to stop the bleeding of the femoral artery before you get to the hospital, right? You have to put the tourniquet on. So the way I see the Four for Reform is sort of like they were the tourniquet for the NRA last year, and now we've got this additional slate of candidates who are going to come in and sort of provide support to that effort and help make more progress. So I should have said that more generously earlier, but so there's been sort of this stop of the bleeding, and they ran. Remember the context when they ran. We didn't know what was going to happen with the trial. Still, was the NRA going to be dissolved? Was the NRA going to
Right.
be? Was there going to be a special court-appointed monitor over the NRA? We had no idea what was going to happen when the 404 reform ran, and a lot of people, I wouldn't say most people, but a lot of people were saying the NRA is a lost cause. Why are you even trying? Well,
Mm-hmm.
now I think there actually is room for a little bit of hope, because we've got this huge slate of reform candidates running for the ballot. If you would tell us a little bit about what makes the reform candidates different from the old guard candidates that are running for the
Right.
board of directors.
It's a diverse group. 12 are on the ballot by petition. 2 are running by write-in. That would be Charles Brown and Paul, and I'm going to crucify his name. I'm going to say Babaz, and I think it's actually pronounced a little differently, from Atlanta. And then there would be, let me do my math here, another 14 that are on the ballot by petition, or on the ballot thanks to the nominating committee. Some are existing board members. Some, like myself, were nominated by the board, by the nominating committee. I also am on the ballot by petition. I'm one of only 2 candidates that are double nominated. And I did that for a reason. I wanted to be on the ballot as a result of the members, not because of some legal wrangling. I came up, there was an affidavit uh, submitted saying how they had opened up the nomination process. And the last bullet point was, we nominated John Richardson of No Lawyers, Only Guns, and Money Block, who who is a known critic of the NRA. So I'm like, okay. Anyway, what we have all committed ourselves to.
A known critic of the Wayne version of the NRA,
correct.
Right?
Good point. We've all committed to reform, to the NRA 2.0, so to speak, where it should be, firearms training, grow the membership, but with integrity and accountability for people. And really, maybe my biggest hobby horse, you can call it my hobby horse or whatever, but transparency. Let people know what's going on. And actually, coming out of the trial, one of my disappointments was that there was not a mandate from the judge that says that the Form 990 needs to be put on the website, the Charity 500, which is the New York form, the bylaws are not on the website, the minutes from the board meetings are not on it, the agenda. All of this needs to be put out there so that the members can know what's going on. And I think all of us have committed to transparency and openness. Trying to avoid going into. A good example would be not just me, but Jeff Knox, who was part of the 4 for Reform. When they did the initial vote on doing away with the Special Litigation Committee, he moved, and it was a roll call vote, and the roll call must be reported publicly in the official journal, the magazines. And it was. So we know who stood in the way of reform and who was for more openness and let's move on. And so you know who stood in the way, and we know who did not.
And there was always this sort of secrecy within the board, and lots of business was conducted in executive session. And it seems like most of the reformers want to give more light to what's going on at the NRA, more transparency, as you say, by not conducting so much business in executive session, only the things that are completely necessary.
I wouldn't mind seeing board meetings being live streamed. If a city council can do it, or a board of adjustment, why not? Go, and if you're in executive session, you turn the camera off, you put up a placard that said, we're in executive session, and then you go back.
The other thing, while we're on this topic of transparency, it's my understanding that, and I don't have complete clarity about how things worked previously, but whenever there was some action taken or committee recommendation, it would get sent out by email blast. It would get sent to headquarters and then get sent out to the board by email, at least in theory. And now, I think after this January meeting, now there's going to be a system where basically it gets distributed to everybody directly, not from some centralized headquarter administrative assistant or whoever was sending these things out. So I think that those sorts of changes will help bring transparency, but also help keep the board members informed about what's going on. Because one of the problems before was that a lot of times members of the board had no idea what was going on, not because of any fault of their own, but because there was this intense effort to keep information close to the Wayne LaPierre group of supporters.
You're absolutely right. And that was actually part of the final order, where the judge said that the NRA must set up a secure website for board members so that they can get documents before the meeting. They can read the agenda. They can know what's going on. Because I think you mentioned that you thought they were emailed. I think it was actually mailed in the by post office.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Maybe
Even worse
FedEx,
than I
but it's
imagined.
paper. And where they can communicate. I mean, right now, if you want to email as a member, you want to send an email to any board member, you're going to have to send an email to the secretary of the NRA and said, could you please forward this for me? Why do you need an intermediary to do that?
Right.
I mean, they don't have to, they could just say, I'm sorry, I can't answer this. That was a confidential matter in an executive session. I hope you'll understand. Or they can give an answer. I mean, I don't see why every board member doesn't have an NRA email that they can be used to respond to people.
One thing, one question I've got lingering in my mind, one of the problems with the NRA is that I think the board of directors is too big, and which is why, frankly, why 28 reformers have to run to change the balance of the board of directors at the NRA. And that was sort of how Wayne was able to get so much power and influence on the board, was by getting a critical mass of people on the board who supported him. And then it didn't matter if one or two people who dissented from his views got on the board. What do you imagine, or has there been any discussion, and I'm sure this would be something that would be discussed further down the road if the reformers are able to get a significant number of positions, how would the board go about shrinking the board of directors, or how do you imagine that would happen?
I'm not sure how others would do it, but I had an idea, one of my ideas about how to do it. And I've served on other nonprofit boards, and none had 76 members. I mean, 76 members is a board of advisors. It's not a board of directors. And that's how Wayne, once he had done, as long as he had executive council, executive committee, he could get away. He could do anything he wanted. My suggestion, the judge left it up to us, but said that we need to really discuss it, is do it over a 3-year process. Let's say we want to drop it down to 25 members. And I like the idea of having an odd number so that you can always make sure that you have a majority. For 3 years, instead of having 25 or 28 open positions, you have 8. The next year you have 8. The third year you have 8. Now you're down to 24, and every year you also vote for what now has become the 25th director, not the 76th director. And so you've cut it by 2/3, from 76 down to 25. Much more manageable, just slightly larger than the executive committee. And then in the meantime, there's nothing to stop us from setting up a board of advisors. That's where you're going to put your people with deep pockets, your celebrities, your athletes, whatever, who maybe do I have to go to another meeting? I don't really care what you're doing, but here's some ideas and here's some ways I can raise money for the NRA. Kind of like a lot of colleges do it that way. You have the board of trustees and the board of advisors, the board of visitors.
Well, I like your suggestion, and like you say, the reform, and this is an important point. The reformers are not all unified in exactly how they foresee making changes at the NRA. And there may be others who have different ideas about how to shrink the board, or may not think that that's a priority to shrink the board. I think many of them think that's important to do. But nevertheless, it's an important point, I think, to mention that there are a number of different ideas, even within the slate of reformers, which brings me to my next point. I want to make sure I put this up before we conclude the podcast. I want to share my screen here momentarily. This is electanewNRA.com, and this is the page with your profile.
Yep.
It has information about you and about what you hope to accomplish, or at least in part. But if you go to, so this is electanewnra.com/Richardson. But if you just go to electanewnra.com, you can find the bios of all the reform candidates there. And here's a page, a landing page with the various reform candidates. Are there any on here in particular that you'd like to draw attention to, John?
Yeah, I mean, for example, right next to me is Jonathan Goldstein, who is a phenomenal attorney. Knox Williams heads the American Suppressor Association. Down below, you had Todd Vandermeide, who not a lawyer, but is a great legal strategist. He was the NRA's, for many years, the NRA's lobbyist in Illinois. Teresa Einacker has fought the good fight in New Jersey. She's an attorney. So there's a lot. On another page, there's Jim Shekels, who is from North Carolina, but he's also the got a big beard, very big in training. Is like the head trainer for the Boy Scouts at their jamborees. He's a training counselor. Frank Tate, my God, I mean, he got on the board, and after being ostracized, and he he's been on a number of boards. I mean, he has served. Pardon me. That's kind of his business, is working with boards as a consultant. So there are a lot of really good people on here. Al Hammond was one of the board members who was pretty blunt and spoke up when they were trying to search for a new EVP when Wayne retired, or Wayne did not retire, resigned. Charlie Hiltonen, the same thing. So I can't say I know everybody on the ticket, but I know enough to know that they didn't get on here just because they had a pretty face.
And you said there were a couple of folks who were sort of spearheading this effort to get these folks on the ballot. I think you mentioned Buzz Mills, and who was the other person?
Rocky Marshall, one of the 4-4 reform.
Okay.
And what people should realize that Rocky has both been on the board before and then got back on the board as a reformer, but he was the CEO of one of the large business segments for international oil services company Baker Hughes. He's got the business experience to actually run the NRA if he wanted to. He's got his own business. But you have a good mix. You have trainers, you have attorneys, you have financial people. And, important that we get a full ballot. You vote for 28. And 2 of those people are going to have to be write-in candidates. Charles Brown, who owns MKS Supply. There was no exception made for people getting on by petition for late petitions being submitted. He had houses he had to close up due to hurricanes. I made it on the ballot by petition. I got my final number of petitions to get over the hump on Friday, and they were due the next Tuesday. I sent them in on Saturday. Next day air, paid almost $100, or I wouldn't have been on by petition, because it was right at the same time as Hurricane Helene.
Wow.
Paul Baba's Atlanta had flooding. So there's no contingency for force majeure or weather-related issues. It's like, no, we interpret the bylaws as saying that you have 45 days and that's that. It's not fair. I mean, I don't want to use fair but there needs to be some leeway in there.
Yeah. Well, I want to say, not only does this website have the list of candidates that are running on the reform platform, I know many of these folks and would consider them excellent candidates, I should say, for NRA board of directors. And but this website also has a do not vote for list. So for your convenience, they've included that here as well.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
um,
there's a couple of new people on the do not vote for list, but virtually everybody who is on that list voted to retain the Special Litigation Committee. Bob Barr, Larry Craig, Isaac Demarest, Carol Frampton, Joel Friedman, Sandy Froman. The list goes on. I'm just going to say that I will not speak ill of them, but I don't think that they would advance the reform necessary needed for the
yeah,
NRA to survive and to prosper again.
I have to say, I don't know very many of these folks personally, but I did hear Isaac Demarest on the Student of the Gun podcast, which, I'm a fan of Student of the Gun. I like the work that they do. But this was shortly after the NRA annual meeting. I think they recorded the podcast at the NRA annual meeting last year.
Mm-hmm.
And Isaac was just emphatic that the trial in New York was politically motivated. There was nothing really going on wrong at the NRA. And that just flies in the face of all the objective evidence that was uncovered as part of that trial and as part of the discovery in that case. I mean, just read some of the depositions in that case, and it's obvious that what was going on at the NRA was not in the best interest of its members. And I think that the folks who may be great people. I mean, Isaac seemed like a great person. That was my impression from hearing him speak. I think just didn't know or didn't have a good grasp of what was going on at the NRA. And so, but either way, whether it's, malicious defense of wrongdoing or just sort of a naive or unknowing defense of wrongdoing, it's not in the best interest of the members. And I think we need an engaged board, a board that knows what's going on, a board that's transparent. And I think that a lot of these folks on the reform slate will help achieve that. So I want to point out a few other things here. And John, I want to make sure we get to anything you want to talk about as well. I should have mentioned this early on. I, of course, mentioned it in the previous podcast that we recorded together, but you obviously have a blog, the Only Guns and Money blog. I actually like it's onlygunsandmoney.com, but the picture at the top of the blog says no lawyers, only guns and money.
And no
So
offense meant to you, Alex, but
no offense taken. I'm on that train as well. I'm not a fan of lawyers in particular either. So no offense taken. But I want to encourage people to go and check out your blog. You, of course, write about the NRA a lot, and as well as other topics as well. So people who want to keep up on the goings on at the NRA, I think you've got a great website. Obviously, NRA in Danger has good
absolutely.
content as well. And then I want to pull up one other article here. And actually, I want to, before I get to that, I want to put up your website. Obviously, you've got the No Lawyers, Only Guns and Money, and you've got right at the top reports on January NRA board meeting. So if folks want to know more about what happened there, you've compiled some information there for people to take a look at.
And I actually have a second one to that came from both Amanda Suffolk and Jeff Knox's reports, since they were
two
both
more reports. I see that.
Two
here.
more, yep.
Okay, excellent. I'll link to both of those in the show notes to this podcast. And that's what I was actually getting ready to point out was Jeff Knox's article at Ammo Land.
Yep.
He has an excellent article there. He was one of the 4 for Reform that was elected last year. His efforts have been, I think, very valiant, and I think he's an important puzzle piece to this reform effort at the NRA. So he's been engaged in the NRA. His father, of course, was very instrumental. Somewhat of a polarizing figure as well, and I think he's done well to carry on the legacy of his father and trying to make the best of an organization to protect the right to keep and bear arms. So,
absolutely.
Anyway, is there any other? Oh, last thing. I've got too many resources here. There were 2 articles that we mentioned pre-show that I wanted to point out as well by John Petrolino at Bearing Arms. He interviewed I should say interviewed. He sent questions to candidates from both sides, the reform side and the old guard, and he posted those at Bearing Arms. I'll put those in the show notes as well. I'd encourage people to go check those out as well.
Yeah, one of John's questions was that, did you fear about being blackballed or ostracized for being on the reform side? I'm like, not in the least. Part of me, as I said, the Second Amendment is bigger than just one organization. And we, in our pre-show, we talked about it a little bit. I mean, the NRA has been, the funds, at one time they were bringing in revenues about 325, 350 million a year. Now they're down to maybe 180. By contrast, since 2019, FPC, Second Amendment Foundation, GOA have all doubled or tripled their revenues. It still is not what the NRA has, which
Yeah.
goes to show why we still need a strong, vibrant NRA. And another thing that was just brought up to me this past week, President Trump's White House counsel, Dave Warrington, is chairman of the National Foundation for Gun Rights, which is NAGR, the National Association of Gun Rights, Dudley Brown. If President Trump has a question on 2A matters, is he going to come to the NRA? Or is he going to ask this guy who's affiliated with Dudley Brown? I mean, at least it's not the Dorr brothers.
Yeah. President Trump needs the right people in his ear when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms, on other issues as well. But he was, as you know better than anybody, or as well as anybody, that Trump and the NRA had a good relationship back when he ran in 2016.
Yes.
And when all these things in New York came to light, that sort of fell apart.
It seems to. Yeah.
Yeah. So the NRA needs to get back to the NRA, the respected NRA that sort of led the charge for defending the right to keep and bear arms. Because even though they're still a relatively large organization, they've not been nearly as effective as they should be.
Go ahead. I was going to say, and the NRA needs to learn how to play well with others. They have not in the past. If it wasn't their bill, they were not necessarily in favor of it, even if it was good for the Second Amendment. And that's got to stop. I think you're starting to see some of that coming out of ILA, where they are joining with other organizations, like FPC, on some lawsuits. And I put that down to Joseph Greenlee, who's the director of litigation, who at one time worked for FPC. So they know one another. If we can work together, we can do it more efficiently, more effectively, and definitely more cost effectively.
What a lot of people don't know, and I'm glad you brought up this point. I discussed this issue with Jeff Knox when he was on the show last year as well, about this idea of the NRA working collaboratively with these other organizations who have been amazing in a time of weakness for the NRA, but still can't quite pick up the pieces that the NRA left behind. FPC, SAF, GOA, these organizations have been fantastic. But what a lot of people don't know is that, and this is just one example, the NRA tried to intervene in Heller to kill the Heller case, which was, of course, an instrumental case in Second Amendment jurisprudence at the Supreme Court. But the NRA didn't like that they weren't the ones who were leading the charge in the case, and they thought they had some concern that the Heller case wouldn't be successful, and so they tried to intervene to kill the case. They brought these other companion cases and hoped that Heller would get set aside in favor of one of these other cases that might not even make it to the Supreme Court. So that's just one example of where the NRA, I think, was sort of engaged in a turf war of sorts. And I think that the NRA needs to get away from that mentality. And I think that the NRA will get away from that turf mentality and work collaboratively with these other organizations if the reform candidates are able to gain influence on the board of directors.
Absolutely. Um, I do know that if I get elected, I would be putting a lot of pressure on ILA to work with even non-NRA affiliated groups and not to sabotage their legislation, which they may or may not have done in the past,
Yeah.
especially in North Carolina.
Yeah. This is a grassroots effort, the right to keep and bear arms, and we need all the help we can get to protect our liberty. And I think that trying to do it all through one organization is a massive mistake. And so I think the NRA can be incredibly important, is incredibly important, can be incredibly important going forward, but needs to work with others in the area to make it truly a grassroots movement, not just an NRA movement.
I think you're absolutely right. And I'm a conservative. I have no apologies for that. The focus should be the Second Amendment and gun rights and nothing more, unless it's in something that would directly impact gun rights. Or I know there's some people, abortion and gun rights have nothing to do with one another. Don't fight that battle. Let other people do that.
Yeah, and when you say the focus of the NRA,
The
right?
focus of the NRA
right.
needs to be on the Second Amendment and only the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
There are plenty of gun owners that are libertarian. There's the Liberal Gun Club. There are liberal-oriented gun owners, and especially now, post-COVID, we have brought in a lot more minorities, a lot more women who may not agree with us on everything, but they would agree with us on their gun rights, and that's all that matters.
Yeah.
And we need to bring them in as members.
Yeah.
And to train. I mean, most of these people have no training. That's where we can do great work.
Well, that's one thing that the NRA did a good job with for a while was the education and training materials and having a network of instructors nationwide and reaching. I mean, because part of preserving our rights going forward is making sure the younger generation is exposed to these ideas and is trained to be responsible armed citizens. And
yeah, absolutely.
So that's part of not only maintaining a strong NRA in the future, but preserving the right to keep and bear arms is reaching the younger generation. So the NRA's got to be really be on the ball with respect to that issue.
Yep. And going back to one of Frank Tato I mentioned earlier, he's a training counselor, and one of his goals was to train trainers in the Metro DC area, an area that's not traditionally pro-gun, but there had a lot of people buying firearms. Therefore, they need trainers. What better outreach can you do?
Well, John, I think that's the only questions I've got. If there's anything else you want to say or anything else you want to talk about, I'm happy to chat about that.
No, I would just say that people should vote. They will see a full 2-page ad from Elect a New NRA on either side of the ballot. The ballot will be in the middle. Our ad will be, when they pull the ballot out, they'll see our ad. And to electanewnra.com, support all the candidates, or I'll say support as many as you can.
Yeah, and the biographical information is right there for you to go check it out. Click on their bio. I'm sure if there's no contact information there, but I'm sure if you want to get in touch with them, there's a way to do that. Of course, John's easy to access because he's got the Only Guns and Money blog. You know what he's up to and what he's thinking on various issues with the NRA. So, John, thanks a bunch for joining the show. I really appreciate your willingness to run for the board of directors. I know that there's a lot of uncertainty with the NRA, but it takes folks like you to be willing to put in the effort and the work to really make a change in what I see as an essential organization for our rights in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of Freedom. As always, you can find the podcast on all the most popular podcast streaming platforms, as well as YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X at Forge of Freedom. You can also find the podcast at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.